For most of human history, no satellite ever told anyone where they were. Yet people crossed oceans, deserts, and continents with precision. They did this centuries before GPS. In the ancient world, position was not calculated by coordinates. It was inferred from the environment. Sailors in the Mediterranean navigated using coastlines, winds, and the rising of familiar stars. Greek and Phoenician mariners described routes not by distance but by sequence: harbors, headlines, prevailing winds. Roman travelers measured journeys by time and terrain, not location. Road itineraries listed stops, not directions. A traveler did not ask, "Where am I?" They asked, "What should I see next?" By the early Middle Ages, navigation still relied on accumulated experience. Arab and Indian Ocean sailors memorized star paths. Each star rose and set along a known bearing. By watching the sky change through the night, direction was maintained. Latitude was estimated by the height of familiar stars above the horizon. No instruments were required at first, only trained observation. On land, direction came from repetition. Trade routes were remembered as sequences of features: river bends, mountain passes, changes in soil and vegetation. Getting lost did not mean failing to read a map. It meant breaking the chain of recognition. Navigation before GPS was not about exact position. It was about staying inside a known system. As long as the system held, movement continued. When it broke, travelers did not recalculate. They stopped, they waited, or they turned back. This is how people found their way before satellites existed, not by knowing where they were, but by knowing what came next. Long before satellites, the sky was the most reliable guide humans had. Unlike land or sea, it did not change with terrain. Stars rose and set in predictable patterns, night after night, year after year. Ancient navigators learned to read this stability. They did not memorize constellations as stories, they memorized them as directions. In the northern hemisphere, Polaris remained nearly fixed. Its height above the horizon revealed latitude. Sailors did not need to know numbers. They only needed to know whether the star was higher or lower than before. In the southern hemisphere, different systems emerged. Navigators used rotating star paths instead of a single fixed point. Entire routes were mapped onto the sky. Each star rose at a specific bearing. Each setting point marked a direction of travel. Arab sailors in the Indian Ocean described these paths centuries before European instruments appeared. They called them star lines. A voyage was planned not by maps, but by sequences of stars followed through the night. As one star sank, another took its place. Direction was maintained without seeing land for weeks. On land, the sky served a similar role. Travelers aligned routes with sunrise and sunset positions. Seasonal changes were accounted for. The rising point of the sun shifted across the horizon through the year. Experienced travelers adjusted automatically. The sky became a moving reference frame, reliable but demanding. Clouds disrupted it, storms erased it. Fatigue made it harder to read, which is why sky navigation required training, not technology, knowledge. Errors were not corrected by recalculation, they were corrected by experience. When the sky returned, orientation returned with it. For thousands of years, this method scaled globally. It worked at sea, it worked on land, it worked anywhere the sky could be seen. Navigation before GPS did not begin with instruments. It began by looking up. Long before coordinates existed, direction was stored in memory. People did not navigate by abstract space. They navigated by recognition. A route was not a line on a map. It was a sequence of known features: a river bend, a lone tree, a change in soil color, a mountain that appeared after 3 days of travel. Navigation depended on remembering what came next. In the ancient world, this kind of route knowledge was everywhere. Greek and Roman travelers described journeys as lists of places, not directions. Roads were learned as progressions, village to village, crossing to crossing. A traveler did not ask how far a place was, they asked what they would encounter along the way. In deserts, landmarks were subtle. Rock formations, shifts in wind-shaped dunes, the taste of water at known wells. Caravans followed paths that existed only in memory. Lose the sequence and the route vanished. Forests worked the same way. Travelers memorized patterns of terrain, slope, drainage, vegetation. A familiar landscape could be navigated even in low visibility. An unfamiliar one could not. This is why guides were essential, not because they knew the destination, but because they knew the order of things. Route knowledge was cumulative. Each journey reinforced the memory. Each deviation carried risk. When a landmark failed to appear, travelers stopped. They retraced steps. They did not improvise. Improvisation without reference was how people disappeared. This system shaped how travel expanded. New routes spread slowly. Only after repetition turned uncertainty into familiarity. Before GPS, before maps, before coordinates, navigation was local. It lived inside people, and it only worked as long as memory held. Before GPS, movement was shaped by forces humans could not control. Wind, water, terrain. Navigation meant understanding how these forces behaved and when they could be trusted. At sea, wind was not an obstacle, it was the road. Sailors learned prevailing wind patterns long before they understood physics. In the Mediterranean, seasonal winds dictated travel windows. Routes existed only at certain times of year. Sailing against the wind was inefficient. Sailing with it was predictable. Entire trade networks formed around this constraint. Currents mattered just as much. Ocean water moved in stable, repeating flows. Experienced sailors recognized them by temperature, color, and debris. A current could carry a ship far off course, or return it reliably toward land. Navigation meant allowing movement, not resisting it. On rivers, direction was reversed. Water defined the route completely. Travel downstream was fast. Upstream was slow and exhausting. Settlements formed where currents changed. Navigation followed the behavior of water, not intention. On land, wind and water still mattered. Snowdrifts shaped winter paths. Floodplains dictated seasonal routes. Grass patterns revealed moisture and elevation. Travelers learned to read landscapes as active systems, not static environments. This knowledge was cumulative, passed orally, corrected by failure. A traveler who ignored the wind wasted energy. One who ignored water risked death. Navigation without GPS required submission to natural forces, not control over them. Direction was not imposed, it was negotiated. Those who understood this traveled far. Those who did not return. Before GPS, time was a form of direction. Not measured precisely, but felt, estimated, and tracked. Travelers did not ask how far a place was, they asked how long it should take. Journeys were defined by duration, a day's walk, 2 nights at sea, 3 sunrises beyond the river. Time replaced distance. At sea, sailors measured progress by hours under sail. Sand glasses marked the passing of time. Each turn of the glass represented movement. Speed was assumed from wind and sail. Distance was inferred. Errors accumulated quietly, but time never stopped. On land, pacing served the same role. Steps were counted, rhythms were maintained. Experienced travelers knew how far they could go before fatigue set in. They knew how terrain altered speed. Hills slowed time. Flat ground extended it. Deserts compressed it. Forests distorted it. Travel plans adjusted constantly. If a landmark did not appear when expected, something was wrong. Either direction had failed or time had been misjudged. In both cases, movement paused. Time also structured safety. Caravans moved to reach water before nightfall. Ships adjusted course to avoid sailing blind in darkness. Seasonal travel depended on daylight length. Navigation required synchronizing movement with the clock of the environment. This made experienced navigators invaluable, not because they were faster, but because they were accurate in their expectations. They knew when something should happen and recognized when it did not. Before GPS, before coordinates, before instruments, navigation relied on prediction. If time passed as expected, direction was likely correct. If it didn't, correction followed. Time was not just measured, it was trusted.
Before GPS, people often navigated by following people. Not directly, but indirectly. Routes formed where movement repeated. Footsteps accumulated. Paths emerged. What looked like a road was often just memory made visible. On land, many routes began as animal trails. Herds moved predictably between water, grazing, and shelter. Humans learned these patterns early. They widened the trails, reinforced them, turned instinct into infrastructure. Trade routes formed the same way. One successful journey encouraged another. Merchants followed paths that were already proven. Risk was reduced by repetition. A route that worked once might work again. Over time, paths became reliable not because they were mapped, but because they were used. Caravans followed traces left by earlier caravans, worn ground, broken branches, stone markers placed deliberately or accidentally. Each traveler added information. Each passage refined the route. At sea, this principle still applied. Shipping lanes emerged where winds, currents, and experience aligned. Captains followed traditional courses handed down verbally. A safe passage was repeated. A dangerous one was avoided. Navigation knowledge spread socially, not technically. This made navigation collective. No single person needed to know everything. They only needed to trust that others had passed before. This trust created momentum. Routes expanded gradually. They rarely appeared suddenly, and they disappeared when usage stopped. A path unused faded back into the landscape. Following others was not passive navigation. It was accumulated judgment. Each traveler relied on the decisions of those who came before. Before GPS, navigation was often less about choosing direction and more about choosing whose footsteps to trust.
Before GPS, navigation used more than sight. It used the body. Sound, smell, and touch carried information when vision failed. In fog, darkness, or dense forest, hearing became directional. Coastlines were located by waves striking rock. Rivers announced themselves before they were seen. Wind moving through gaps revealed terrain. Experienced travelers listened continuously. Sound indicated proximity. Silence indicated risk. At sea, sailors recognized land by smell. Vegetation carried on wind, wet earth, smoke from settlements. Bird activity changed near shore. These cues appeared long before land became visible. They were not precise, but they were reliable. On land, smell guided survival. Water sources had distinct scents. Animals clustered where water existed. So did insects. Travelers followed these signals instinctively. Touch also mattered. Ground texture changed with elevation and moisture. Hard-packed soil became soft near water. Cold air pooled in low ground. Warmth rose toward slopes. Feet, skin, and breath detected these shifts. Navigation relied on constant sensory feedback. If the environment felt wrong, movement slowed. If it felt familiar, movement continued. This is why experienced navigators could travel in conditions that blinded others. They did not depend on a single sense. They integrated many. Navigation before GPS was not visual precision. It was sensory awareness. The environment spoke. Only trained travelers knew how to listen.
Before GPS, navigation survived by being taught, not written down, not standardized, passed directly between people. Knowledge moved orally, from elders to apprentices, from experienced travelers to first-timers. Routes were explained as stories, not narratives, instructions. Turn after the third hill. Rest where the water tastes metallic. Do not travel after the second sunset. Memory carried direction. Mistakes were corrected socially. A traveler who returned adjusted the route description. One who did not return removed it entirely. Navigation knowledge evolved through survival. In many cultures, this knowledge was guarded, not because it was secret, but because it was valuable. Knowing a safe route meant control over trade, access to resources, power. This is why guides existed everywhere, in deserts, in mountains, at sea. They were living navigation systems, not because they calculated position, but because they carried accumulated experience. Songs preserved routes, so did chants. Rhythms encoded distance and sequence. A verse ended where rest was possible. A refrain marked danger. These systems reduced error. They also reduced dependence on individuals. Knowledge survived even when people did not. Navigation before GPS was collective intelligence, built slowly, tested constantly, shared carefully. Direction did not belong to tools, it belonged to communities, and it only worked as long as knowledge continued to move. Before GPS, tools existed, but they did not calculate position. They supported judgment. The most important instruments were simple, and they worked because humans understood their limits. The magnetic compass did not reveal location, it revealed direction. Early compasses pointed consistently north, not precisely. Variation existed, but consistency mattered more than accuracy. As long as direction remained stable, routes held. At sea, sailors combined compass direction with memory. They knew which bearing to hold after leaving a coast. They knew when to expect land to reappear. The compass did not replace experience, it reduced uncertainty. The astrolabe served a similar role. It did not tell sailors where they were, it helped estimate latitude by measuring the height of stars. Used incorrectly, it misled. Used carefully, it constrained error. Later instruments improved this process. The quadrant, the cross-staff, the backstaff. Each added precision but also complexity. They required training and calm conditions. On land, tools remained minimal. Simple sighting sticks aligned direction with landmarks. Shadow lengths confirmed time and orientation. Even a staff planted in the ground could reveal cardinal directions by its shadow arc. These instruments did not automate navigation, they anchored it. They provided reference points when memory alone was not enough. But they never removed responsibility. A misread instrument was worse than none at all, which is why early navigators distrusted tools without understanding them. Before GPS, instruments assisted navigation. They did not replace the navigator. Direction still depended on interpretation. Judgment still mattered, and failure still carried consequences. Before GPS, navigation failure was common, and it was often fatal. People did not get lost dramatically. They drifted. Small errors accumulated. Direction weakened gradually, until certainty disappeared.
At sea, misjudging wind or current carried ships far from intended routes. A course held too long became dangerous. A correction made too late was useless. Land was not missed suddenly. It simply did not appear when expected. On land, failure followed a similar pattern. A landmark did not arrive. Water was not where memory said it should be. Time passed without confirmation. Experienced travelers recognized this moment immediately. They stopped moving forward, because moving blindly made things worse. Most disasters happened after hesitation, after travelers tried to recover progress instead of preserving safety. History records many such failures. Caravans that vanished between known wells, ships that sailed past entire continents without realizing it, explorers who trusted instruments without understanding conditions. Navigation systems worked only inside their assumptions. When weather changed, when terrain shifted, when memory failed, the system collapsed. This is why early navigation prioritized retreat over persistence. Turning back was not failure, it was survival. Continuing forward without reference was the real risk. Before GPS, being lost did not mean not knowing where you were. It meant not knowing what to trust anymore. When landmarks failed, when the sky disappeared, when time no longer matched expectation, navigation stopped, and survival depended on restraint. The people who lived were not the boldest, they were the ones who stopped soon enough. Before GPS, navigation was never exact. Error was expected. The goal was not precision, it was containment. Navigators assumed they were slightly wrong, so systems were built to discover how wrong and correct it slowly. At sea, correction depended on confirmation, a glimpse of land, a known depth change, a familiar bird species. These signals were not dramatic, they were subtle, but they allowed error to be reduced instead of eliminated. Sailors practiced deliberate bias. They aimed slightly off target, so land would appear on a known side. Missing land entirely was worse than arriving displaced. This technique turned uncertainty into predictability. On land, travelers used the same logic. Routes were chosen to intersect rivers, ridges, or coastlines. Linear features acted as error traps. If direction drifted, the feature would still be reached. Once found, orientation returned. This is why early routes favored edges, shorelines, valleys, watersheds, places where error collapsed into certainty. Time also helped correction. If travel took longer than expected, speed was reassessed. If landmarks appeared too early, direction was questioned. Error was diagnosed indirectly, never calculated. This made navigation conservative. Progress was cautious. Correction favored safety over efficiency. Before GPS, success depended on not fixing mistakes quickly, but fixing them reliably. Slow correction kept people alive. Fast correction got them lost. Before GPS, not all navigation aimed at arrival. Sometimes the goal was not to be found. In dangerous territory, unpredictability was safety. Travelers learned when precision increased risk and when vagueness protected them. At sea, sailors avoided direct routes during conflict. A straight line was easy to intercept. Indirect paths reduced encounters. Courses were altered deliberately. Landfalls were delayed. Navigation became evasive. On land, this principle was older still. Nomadic groups avoided fixed routes. Paths shifted seasonally. Camp locations changed regularly. Predictable movement invited attack. Unpredictable movement preserved survival. Smugglers relied on this logic. So did refugees. So did messengers in wartime. Navigation systems were designed to be opaque. Only insiders knew the full sequence. Outsiders saw only fragments. This meant routes could not be followed easily, even if discovered once. In some environments, getting slightly lost was safer than being precisely found. Deserts illustrate this clearly. Travelers avoided straight lines between wells. They approached water indirectly. Tracks were minimized. Return paths differed from outward ones. Navigation prioritized concealment over efficiency. This strategy required confidence and discipline. Losing orientation intentionally is different from losing it accidentally. The first is controlled. The second is fatal. Before GPS, skilled navigators understood both states. They knew when to be accurate and when to remain deliberately imprecise. Navigation was not just about reaching destinations. It was also about managing visibility. Sometimes, the safest route was the one no one else could predict.
Before GPS, navigation became reliable only when it was standardized, not everywhere, but enough to connect distant systems. Direction had to mean the same thing to different people, in different places, at different times. This is where shared conventions mattered. Cardinal directions became fixed references. North, south, east, and west were no longer abstract ideas. They were agreed orientations. Compasses reinforced this agreement, not by being perfect, but by being consistent. Once direction could be shared, routes could be coordinated. At sea, this changed everything. Captains could exchange bearings. Courses could be repeated by strangers. Navigation stopped being purely local knowledge. It became transferable. On land, similar standards emerged. Roads aligned with known directions. Cities oriented streets deliberately. Markets, gates, and temples were positioned using shared orientation rules. Direction became part of infrastructure. Time standards followed. Travel instructions referenced days and seasons consistently. A route described in one region could be understood in another. Not exactly, but closely enough to work. This standardization reduced dependence on individual guides. It also reduced ambiguity. But it came with trade-offs. Local adaptations were lost. Flexible navigation gave way to fixed expectations. When standards failed, confusion spread quickly. Still, the benefits were overwhelming. Navigation scaled. Trade expanded. Coordination improved. Before GPS, standardization was the closest thing to automation. It did not replace judgment, but it allowed judgment to travel. Before GPS, the most difficult navigation problem was open water. No landmarks, no fixed reference points, only movement. Sailors crossed oceans knowing that nothing visible would confirm their direction for weeks. Navigation at sea depended on combining imperfect systems. None worked alone. Together, they constrained error. Direction came from the sky and the compass. Speed came from wind, sail, and experience. Time linked them together. This method is known as dead reckoning. But at sea, dead reckoning was never exact. Currents pushed ships sideways. Winds shifted unpredictably. Storms erased progress entirely. Position was always an estimate, which is why ocean navigation relied on expectation. Sailors did not search randomly for land. They sailed toward where land should appear. Latitude was held as consistently as possible. East-west movement was allowed to drift. When the latitude matched expectation, landfall became likely. This is how entire oceans were crossed, not by knowing where the ship was, but by narrowing where it could be. Experienced sailors read the ocean itself. Watercolor changed near continental shelves.
Wave patterns reflected distant land. Bird behavior signaled proximity to shore. Floating vegetation carried information. These signs appeared gradually, and they were never trusted alone. Navigation at sea required patience. Correction was slow. Confirmation was rare. Confidence came from consistency, not proof. Before GPS, ocean navigation succeeded not because sailors were certain, but because they were methodical. They reduced uncertainty step by step until land eventually appeared, not where they aimed precisely, but close enough to survive. Before GPS, most travel happened without roads, no fixed paths, no signs, no maintained routes. Land navigation depended on reading terrain itself. People moved where movement was easiest. Valleys guided direction, ridges offered visibility, watersheds defined boundaries. Travel avoided resistance. It followed natural gradients. Paths formed where terrain allowed repetition. Steep slopes were bypassed, marshes were avoided, dense forest was skirted rather than crossed. A route was simply the least costly option. This logic shaped migration, trade, expansion. Travelers learned to anticipate terrain before seeing it. Clouds clinging to mountains revealed elevation. Vegetation changes marked soil and moisture. Animal movement hinted at passable ground. Navigation without roads meant continuous evaluation. Direction was flexible. Efficiency mattered more than straightness. On land, straight lines were dangerous. They crossed obstacles blindly. Curved paths survived. This is why early routes followed contours, why mountain passes became permanent, why cities formed at natural crossings. Navigation was never imposed on land, it emerged from it. Before GPS, success on land depended on yielding to geography. Those who forced direction exhausted themselves. Those who listened to terrain arrived. Land did not need instructions, it provided them. Before GPS, navigation was shaped by people as much as geography. Routes did not exist in neutral space. They passed through territories, controlled lands, social boundaries. Knowing where to travel was not enough. Travelers had to know where they were allowed to be. In many regions, the safest route was not the shortest. It was the one that avoided conflict. Borders were rarely marked on the ground. They were understood socially. A river might divide groups. A ridge might signal control. Crossing the wrong line could be fatal. Navigation required political awareness. Messengers memorized which villages were hostile, which demanded tribute, which offered protection. Caravans adjusted routes seasonally to avoid rival groups. Sea routes followed similar logic. Certain waters were controlled by powers with ships, others were avoided entirely. Sailors knew where interception was likely. They altered course long before danger appeared. This created invisible corridors of movement, safe passages known only through experience. On land, guides mattered not just for terrain, but for diplomacy. They knew who could be approached, who could not, which paths were tolerated, which were forbidden. Navigation systems encoded this knowledge subtly. Routes curved around power. They bent away from danger. They favored neutrality. Before GPS, direction was inseparable from politics. A technically perfect route meant nothing if it crossed the wrong authority. Survival depended on understanding human boundaries. Navigation succeeded when movement respected power. Those who ignored it rarely arrived. Before GPS, navigation survived by expecting failure. No single method was trusted alone. Every system assumed error, and every journey built redundancy. Direction came from more than one cue. If the sky failed, terrain remained. If landmarks vanished, time still passed. If time misled, sound, wind, or water corrected it. Navigation worked because systems overlapped. Memory was central to this. Routes were not stored as single instructions. They were layered. A traveler remembered the sequence, but also the alternatives. If the river bend was missed, the ridge still existed. If the ridge failed, the valley would eventually appear. This redundancy slowed travel, but it prevented collapse. Experienced navigators never relied on the first confirmation. They waited for the second and the third. One sign suggested direction. Multiple signs confirmed it. Error was not eliminated, it was bounded. When systems disagreed, movement paused. When they aligned, movement resumed. This discipline separated survival from loss. Navigation without GPS was conservative by design. Progress was less important than reversibility. Every decision preserved the option to retreat. Every route was chosen with escape in mind. This is why early navigation looks inefficient by modern standards. Detours were intentional. Margins were wide. Certainty was rare, but survival rates were high. Before GPS, people did not trust precision. They trusted overlap. And it was this redundancy that allowed navigation to work for millennia. Before GPS, navigation stopped being only a skill. It became infrastructure. Routes hardened into systems. What began as memory and experience was embedded into the world itself. Roads were not built everywhere. They were built where navigation already worked. Repeated movement justified permanence. Stone replaced soil. Bridges replaced fords. Markers replaced memory. Infrastructure reduced cognitive load. Travelers no longer needed to remember every detail. The environment carried part of the knowledge. Roman roads did not tell travelers where they were. They told them where to go next. Milestones measured progress. Way stations regulated rest. Navigation shifted from interpretation to execution. At sea, infrastructure was invisible but real. Ports standardized entry. Lighthouses marked danger and safety. Harbor alignments guided approach long before land was visible. These structures did not replace navigation. They narrowed uncertainty. They told sailors when to trust direction and when to slow down. On land, inns, caravanserais, and market towns emerged at predictable intervals. Distance became regular. Time became predictable. Routes synchronized movement across regions. Navigation became less personal and more institutional. This shift increased scale. Trade expanded. Travel accelerated. But dependency grew. When infrastructure failed, so did navigation. A broken bridge erased a route. A ruined port removed a safe approach. Before GPS, infrastructure was memory made permanent. It carried direction forward in time. But it also fixed routes in place. And fixed systems, once broken, were harder to replace. For most of human history, maps were not tools for navigation. They were records, symbols of power, ways to explain territory after it had already been traveled. Early maps did not guide movement, they summarized knowledge. Distances were distorted, directions were approximate. What mattered was relationship, not precision. A river connected two places, a mountain separated them. That was enough. Navigation still happened in the world, not on parchment. Travelers did not consult maps mid-journey. They relied on memory, guides, and systems already in motion. Maps were studied before departure or after return. When maps slowly became more practical, they changed navigation indirectly. Routes could be discussed abstractly. Journeys could be planned without personal experience. Knowledge began to detach from individuals. But this introduced a new risk. Maps froze information. They could not adapt to weather, or conflict, or seasonal change. A correct map used at the wrong time became dangerous. This is why early navigators distrusted maps. They treated them as suggestions, not instructions. Maps worked best when combined with lived systems: sky, time, terrain, memory. Used alone, they misled. Used together, they amplified reach. Navigation did not suddenly improve when maps appeared. It shifted from embodied knowledge to stored knowledge, from flexible systems to fixed representations. Before GPS, maps were the final layer, not the foundation. They helped people imagine movement, but movement itself still depended on everything that came before.
GPS did not replace maps, it replaced judgment. For thousands of years, navigation was an active process. People constantly evaluated the world around them. They noticed change, they questioned assumptions, they adjusted. Direction was never final, it was provisional. GPS collapsed this process into certainty, a fixed position, a calculated route, a constant correction. The burden of interpretation disappeared. So did redundancy. Modern navigation assumes accuracy. When it fails, there is no fallback. The sky is ignored, terrain is overlooked, time is abstract, memory is unused. This is why GPS failures feel catastrophic, not because people are lost, but because the system offers no alternative mode. Earlier navigation trained people to expect uncertainty, to slow down, to stop, to verify. Movement was cautious, reversible, grounded in multiple signals. GPS optimized for efficiency, not resilience. This is not a criticism, it is a trade-off. Modern navigation is faster, safer, more precise, but it externalized skills that once lived inside people. Before GPS, navigation was not about knowing where you were, it was about staying oriented despite doubt. That skill still matters when signals drop, when systems fail, when technology disappears. The older methods return immediately. Look up, observe terrain, track time, move conservatively, trust overlap. GPS did not erase human navigation. It replaced the need to practice it. And that is why the past still matters, not as nostalgia, but as a backup system, one that still works.